Welcome to the Attention Deficit Disorder Expert Podcast Series by Attitude Magazine.
We hope everyone is staying safe and staying well. We are pleased to have Roberto Olivardia here to talk about eating and nutrition strategies for ADHD adults. Before we get started, let me note a couple of housekeeping items. Those of you tuned into the live webinar may download the slides now by clicking on the Event Resources section of your webinar screen. And if you're interested in the Certificate of Attendance option, look for instructions in the email you receive around an hour after the live broadcast. For those of you listening in replay or podcast mode, please visit the webinar replay page on the Attitude website. And that URL is www.attitudemag.com/podcast-332/ for access to both the accompanying slides and the Certificate of Attendance option. Also, today's webinar sponsor is Excentrate, a dietary supplement that is specifically formulated to address the nutritional deficiencies known to be associated with ADHD. Excentrate contains the omega-3 fatty acids EPA and DHA in the phospholipid form, which has been shown to be the preferred carrier to the brain. The brain-ready nutrition provided in Excentrate is working 24/7 and helps the body heal even while sleeping. For more information on it, go to www.excentrate.com. Attitude thanks our sponsors for supporting our webinars. Sponsorship has no influence on speaker selection or webinar content. Now for today's topic. Healthy eating poses many challenges for people with ADHD. And as most of us have found out, this is especially true during the pandemic, when so many of us are working or learning from home with easy access to the kitchen cabinets and refrigerator. Research shows that healthy eating makes for a healthier ADHD brain. Since people with ADHD carry a higher risk for obesity, it is important for children and adults to incorporate mindful eating practices and solid nutrition into their everyday lives. A key component of managing ADHD symptoms is developing a positive relationship with food. Dr. Olivardia will help us create a diet nutrition plan that will work for the ADHD brain. Dr. Olivardia is a clinical psychologist and clinical instructor of psychology at Harvard Medical School. He maintains a private psychotherapy practice in Lexington, Massachusetts, where he specializes in the treatment of attention deficit, ADHD basically, executive functioning issues, and issues that face students with learning differences. He has spoken on numerous radio shows, podcasts, and webinars, and presents at many talks and conferences around the country. You can ask questions to Dr. Olivardia during his presentation, and we will try to get to as many of them as we can after he finishes. That all being said, I'll turn it over to the expert. Roberto, thanks so much for being here today. I know we're all looking forward to the presentation on such a key issue in our lives.
Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure being part of these Attitude webinars. So as you can see from this slide, this is a Thanksgiving meal and dessert. We have Thanksgiving coming up in a couple of weeks for those of us in the U.S. And those of us will be eating and indulging in food and enjoying all the food that we have. And most likely, many of us with ADHD at the end of Thanksgiving night will think we ate a little bit too much, might loosen our belt, think, did I really need that extra slice of pie? Did I need that fourth helping of turkey and stuffing? So this is probably a very appropriate time to be talking about eating and healthy eating. So first, I just want to talk about why this is an issue and talking about for people with ADHD. What studies actually show is, as we know, ADHD affects all different executive functions. And when we think about executive functions and what we have to do to regulate, it's really the day-to-day things that are most going to be impacted by ADHD. Sleep, eating, all of the daily tasks that we need to do. But eating is often something that we don't really think about as much in relation to ADHD. but involves so many executive functions, as I'll talk about. So there was a study that looked at children in a lab that had actually simulated sort of a kitchen where they were assessed in their mood, they were assessed what food they liked, their hunger levels, and they had groups of kids that had ADHD, groups of kids that did not have ADHD, and they found that overall, when they controlled for hunger before and such, that the kids with ADHD ate significantly more food. Now, what was more surprising, even to the researchers, was that this was not influenced by a mood state and their level of hunger or even their liking of the food. And so if we take that in for a moment to think that kids with ADHD ate more even of foods they didn't like, simply because it was there. And that's something, I joke often that, for those of us, I have ADHD. For those of us with ADHD, we're on a seafood diet. If we see it, we eat it, and simply because it's there. Other studies have found that people with ADHD tend to have very disruptive, dysregulated eating habits, eating less nutritional diets, having more of a sugar intake. In a study of more than 62,000 children, the study found that those children who were not medicated and who had ADHD had 1.5 times the rate of being overweight than either children without ADHD or children who were on medication for their ADHD. Similarly, another large study in Germany of over 11,000 German children found that symptoms of hyperactivity were associated significantly with poorer nutritional quality, greater high energy food intake, that means sugar, simple carbs, and greater exposure to television. Now, when they even look at studies looking at people who struggle with obesity, including this one, which was a study of patients who were presenting for bariatric surgery or basically getting weight loss surgery, in a sample of 215 people, they found that almost a third of the people had ADD, had more the inattentive type of ADD. What's striking is that when the body mass index looked at people who were over 40, which is in the morbid obese category, almost about 43% of them had ADHD. So not only did that affect their ability in terms of becoming obese, but also post-surgery, they found that the group with ADHD lost less weight post-surgery than the groups without ADHD. So they were less likely to be compliant also with some of the instructions, because you have to eat differently after you get such surgery. In a small study that looked at an obesity clinic and had for a very small sample of 13 boys, 13 girls, and they had assessed them for ADHD. These were all kids who were morbidly obese. They did not meet any criteria for depression, anxiety, any other DSM disorder. And those researchers found that 58% of them had ADHD, which is significantly higher than what you would find in the general population. And what's also interesting is of those children with ADHD, only 40% of them were diagnosed before the study. So this is just a data point, for people who are working in fields of nutrition, in the field of obesity, that ADHD really is something that really has to be assessed and paid attention to, because a lot of people a lot of medical providers may not realize how much of an influence and an impact having ADHD has on this. In a study in 2004, Holtkamp and colleagues had hypothesized that perhaps kids who are hyperactive ADHD were less likely to be obese, maybe because they were running around and they expended a lot more energy and calories. The opposite was actually found, that of 97 ADHD male patients, that the BMI scores, the body mass index scores, were significantly higher for the ADHD population. And for those who had a BMI over the 90th percentile, that ADHD was significantly more common. So being hyperactive doesn't protect anyone from ADHD to develop obesity. So what is it about having ADHD and the ADHD brain that makes us more at risk for being overweight and engaging in unhealthy eating patterns? So first and foremost is understanding the ADHD brain. That the ADHD brain, we have these various neurotransmitters in our brain, and one of them is dopamine. Dopamine is implicated in reward and motivation. And basically, if you have adequate levels of dopamine, you are adequately stimulated, which means you're not going to be seeking or oriented towards more reward in your environment. If you have less available dopamine, which the ADHD brain has less available dopamine, you are oriented now into your environment by what is going to stimulate me, aka what's going to give me that dopamine hit in reward. So people with ADHD have what's called a reward deficiency syndrome, where it is by nature, the ADHD brain is a bored, understimulated brain. Food is a very quick way to get dopamine hit. Now, I should also say food that isn't very nutritious is a great dopamine hit. Sugar, simple carbohydrates produce a dopamine hit in the brain. In addition, there's another neurotransmitter called GABA. And when we have appropriate levels of GABA, we are appropriately inhibited, which means that on that Thanksgiving meal, the person with an appropriate level of or healthy level of GABA says, I had 3 pieces of pie. If I have 4, I'm probably going to feel sick and regret it after. So I'm going to wait and just have the piece of pie tomorrow. If you have low levels of GABA, you may think that. You might not even go through that process. But even if you do, you're like, yeah, but I want it anyway. You're uninhibited. The ADHD brain has less GABA. So now you have a bored, understimulated, uninhibited brain. There's a lot of research looking at dopamine receptors in the brain, and they find that there's one gene called the DRD4 gene, which has been implicated and mapped to ADHD. It's also been mapped to obesity and binge eating behavior. So this is something that has genetic influences as well. Alan Zemetkin and colleagues did a study in the early 90s that found that the ADHD brain was slower to absorb glucose than the non-ADHD brain, particularly in the prefrontal area of the brain where a lot of our executive controls are. And we know that because of executive functioning deficits, people with ADHD need a lot more fuel, so to speak, in that executive tank. And sometimes sugar and simple carbohydrates produce that quick kind of burst of energy. Of course, it doesn't sustain, and overall, it actually isn't healthy to the brain. But that construction of what we know about the brain and neurotransmitters really lends itself to somebody craving higher sugar, higher simple carb. When I say simple carbs, I'm talking about refined carbohydrates like potato chips, French fries, or simple carbohydrates, which basically break down into the body like sugar. I mean, it's really no different than like what sugar does. And unfortunately, kale doesn't do that. Kale doesn't give us a dopamine hit. Eating a salad doesn't give us a dopamine hit. So for an ADHD brain that's really craving that, it's unfortunate, but the less healthy foods are going to sort of do that more. Cognitively, as I mentioned before, there are a lot of executive functioning issues that people with ADHD are more likely to have a low interoceptive awareness. So what I mean by that is our interoceptive awareness is our ability to be mindful to what's happening inside our bodies. Am I hungry? Am I satisfied? Am I tired? Am I, sleepy right now? And as we know, sleep issues affect people with ADHD. Similarly, we're sort of, in a sense, we need more grounding to be connected to our inner body. And people with ADHD, and I use as personal example, I remember when I was 10 years old at Chuck E. Cheese, when Chuck E. Cheese was cool. Now it's not so cool. And my friend had a birthday party. This is when Chuck E. Cheese first came out. I love pizza. It's my favorite food. And there was lots of pizza left over. And my friend's mom said, kids, eat up the pizza because I don't want to throw it away. I don't want to waste it. And I was like, okay. And I remember there were some kids that were like, oh no, that's fine. I'm full. And I looked at them and I went, oh, you didn't like the pizza? And they're like, no, I like the pizza. I'm just full. And I'm like, oh, you just didn't like this pizza? They're like, no, I like that pizza. I'm just not hungry. And I laugh at it now, but I kid you not, I did not fundamentally understand how you can like something like this pizza. It's in front of you. There's more of it. What are you talking about? You're full. Like you're done eating when it's gone is sort of like how I looked at it. I had a similar thing about sleep. I mean, throughout, even in my early adulthood I'm tired when there's nothing left to do. And so this is something that's very common for people with ADHD, that of really attending to how do I attend internally as opposed to just externally. We also know that to eat healthy, we have to have a certain level of executive function. We have to know how to manage time, to make recipes. We have to make decisions. What am I going to eat? And the decision isn't what am I going to eat at the time I should be eating? It's, thinking in the morning, what am I going to cook tonight? Because I might need to defrost something. I might need to get the vegetables. I might need to chop stuff up. I need to organize, have our working memory. We have to plan. We have to shift if we're, cooking, especially an elaborate, recipe. It's at that point for a lot of people with ADHD, it might seem easier to just do takeout. Behaviorally, people with ADHD were more impulsive, and obviously impulsive eating is much more common in people with ADHD. We have poor sleep habits, and there's a whole literature on how sleep deprivation is actually one of the major contributing factors to obesity in this country. When we don't sleep adequately, our body assumes that we're in a state of famine and that we are not sleeping because we need to look for food. And so it does these amazing things without us necessarily asking it to. It lowers our metabolism, so we're not burning off any calories, and it's increasing our desirability and craving for fat. And so now if it doesn't understand that you're up and eating pizza because you're just binge watching a show on Netflix. So now that pizza that you're eating at 2 a.m, not only is it not going to burn off, but it's actually going to take in more fat than it would if you were getting a good night's sleep, because it assumes that you're in some state of famine. And so let's take in the fat, sort of like when a bear binge eats before the winter time to hibernate so that body can live off of all of that fat. People with ADHD are less likely to exercise. They're more likely to watch and be engaged in television and visual media. People with ADHD also are likely to skip meals due to hyperfocus, but then it can lead to overeating later on. I call it like being hit with the wall of hunger. It would happen to me in college all the time, where I'd be working on a paper. I couldn't even get out of the hyperfocus zone. 12 hours later, after not eating anything, my couch looks good with ketchup on it. I mean, that's how hungry I am. And then at that point, you're eating more calories than you would have had you eaten regularly throughout the day. People with ADHD are also more likely to eat while doing other things, which leads to a lack of mindfulness of what they're eating. I have patients which is very dangerous, they eat breakfast while driving to work, while, doing other things. So they're not even aware of what they ate. Even when I ask them, what did you eat for breakfast yesterday? Sometimes like, I know I ate, I honestly don't even know what I did. And it's often because they were doing something else that was so distracting that they weren't even attuned to what they were eating. Now, we've all heard of stress eating. I'm sure with the election that a lot of people, Ben & Jerry's was probably in good business over the last week, with various pints of ice cream consumed. So we all know stress eating. If we're feeling angry, if we're feeling emotional, people with ADHD are more apt to have emotional dysregulation issues. We know 30% of people with ADHD struggle with anxiety. So it makes sense that all of those things would lend themselves to using food as a method of soothing or grounding. The emotion or lack of, I guess, that I hear most from ADHD patients is boredom. That a lot of times they eat because they're bored. And as one of my patients said, it's either going to be a cigarette in my mouth, I'm going to bite my nails, or I need to eat something. It's just, I need that sort of oral kind of stimulation. And the nighttime often tends to be sort of the toughest time because there's a lot less happening. And so food becomes this available resource. So just shifting to food in general and why we have to pay attention to this and how important it really is we're in a pretty exciting time of research looking at the importance of nutrition on the brain. There are terms like nutritional psychiatry. If you Google that term, you'll come across there's a lot of research now looking at combining the worlds of nutrition and psychiatry and psychology and understanding that food and mood can really have this relationship that, on one hand, intuitively might have made sense to us, but we're seeing some really good research that is really seeing this. I always tell people we want to think of our bodies like a car and the food as fuel. In fact, most people that I know with ADHD might be take better care of their video game consoles and their cars and their stereo systems or whatnot than their bodies. We kind of have this detached relationship in some way with our body, and we want to understand that what we're putting in our body is affecting not only the moment, but sort of our longevity. So we want the term an antioxidant is basically when we eat foods that are high in antioxidant, it protects our brain from something called oxidative stress, which is basically anytime our body is using oxygen, it produces like this waste kind of in the brain in a way that could damage our cells. So if we eat food that's very healthy and antioxidant food in particular, it really helps protect the brain from this oxidative stress that produces and keeps those cells healthy basically in the brain. So unhealthy food doesn't get rid of that waste and it damages cells in the brain. And diets that are high in refined sugars promote inflammation and oxidative stress. So it's a pretty clear correlation that we see in, high sugar diets. High sugar diets can also impair brain function, executive function. It could exacerbate mood disorder symptoms. Now, what I mean by that is not like here you have sugar and now you become depressed, but because you're having the sugar, and more importantly, because what you're not having is not then adequately protecting the brain. In fact, in nutrition science, they often say it's not so much what you're eating, it's what you're not eating that you have to really pay attention to. And so a diet that's high in sugar means that, because we can be filled and feel a sense of satiety, but we're not getting any nutrition, which means that we're not taking in proteins and omega-3 fatty acids and other important nutrients. And that's really what's harming our bodies. So I'm not promoting eat a ton of sugar, but be aware that a lot of times when people are talking about these diets, it's more, I want people to think more from the perspective of what should I be including more in my diet and satisfying myself with, because if you eat, let's say, more protein and more fiber, you become more full, you're less likely going to resort to eating sugars and simple carbs. Serotonin is another neurotransmitter that's implicated in our mood, in sleep, and appetite regulation, and it can inhibit pain. And 95% of serotonin is produced in the gastrointestinal tract, which is lined with millions of neurons. And there's a whole emerging field of looking at our gut and microbiomes and understanding that these neurons can be influenced by good bacteria that can limit inflammation and improve absorption of nutrients and activate neural pathways to the brain. And they find, for example, the Mediterranean diet, which is a diet that is known to be high in fruits and vegetables, unprocessed grains, seafood, modest amounts of meat and dairy, less refined sugars, and find that people who engage in that, may have a 25 to 35% lower risk of depression. And so we know that this nutrition is not just affecting our weight. It could be affecting our brain. It could be implicated in a lot of other things as well. So what do we do with this information? So first is trying to have a checklist of staples that you can start to incorporate in your diet. And that could include high protein snacks with the ADHD brain responds very well to a lot of protein. It could be eggs, it could be cheese sticks, it could be various nuts. And so finding things, that you like, because again, this won't work if you're eating something that you just don't like simply because it's good for you. Although I always tell people, try it a couple times, maybe a couple different brands. Maybe you might not like all almonds, but might like a particular company or flavor of almonds, and that might be the thing that sticks with you. Try to move away from less simple carbs. So if you have less of simple carbohydrates, so things like with corn syrup in them, and sugar. And I'm not coming from a place also of any elimination diet, unless somebody, of course, has like a food allergy, but like of this diet mentality, I also want to move away from. I also work in the field of eating disorders and am very sensitive and conscious to diet language and mentality. And that's something that can set people up to have a lot of disordered eating. So it's not, I can't have this because it has sugar in it. It's let's be mindful. Look at the label. How much sugar does it have? And is it worth it? Could you have something that might have a little less sugar in it and have more of the nutrition? Vegetables, more complex carbohydrates we want to incorporate. Vegetables, fruit, barley, quinoa. Quinoa is one of the easiest things to make. And this is something that, certainly for people with ADHD, we're always interested in what's fast, what's easy. Quinoa, super easy to make. You put in a pot, you put some water, you let it boil, let it simmer, and it's done. And it can be very tasty and very filling. Omega-3 fatty acids have been found to be incredibly nutritious and very helpful for the ADHD brain. And you'll often find that in seafood, tuna, salmon. You also see it in olive oil and in nuts. B vitamins, legumes, whole grains, beans, seeds, spinach, avocado. These are all, like you'll often hear terms like superfoods or power foods. These are often in those categories of what we see, these power foods, because they're brain boosting and they're very filling, which then means, again, if you're eating more of those foods, you're not going to crave the sugar as much and the more simple carbohydrates. Zinc is also a nutrient that is said that the ADHD brain, there's some research looking at that the ADHD brain might have some deficits in eating. You'll see zinc in meat and in shellfish and eggs, iron, which is found in red meat. But if you are a vegetarian or a vegan, you can find it in beans or iron fortified cereals. Magnesium is, one of those some people can take in vitamin form. It's found in, this might make a lot of people happy, dark chocolate, avocado, almonds, tofu, and banana. Now, again, with these is keeping in mind, like I can't even imagine eating tofu. I don't like the taste of, and I was a vegetarian many years ago. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, do I have to eat tofu? No, don't eat something that you're not going to like. But if you can find a way to expose yourself to it, maybe it's asking people, hey, and I tried. I mean, with tofu, people will be like, oh, try it this way, that way. It just doesn't work for me. High fiber is a really good nutrient. So think of fiber as something that when we eat and it kind of expands in the stomach. So it takes up space in the stomach, which then lessens our hunger cues and again makes us less likely to want to snack more. Quinoa, oatmeal, flaxseed, even adding a tablespoon or two of flaxseed to an oatmeal to your yogurt can go a long way in terms of fiber content. Chia seeds, which I put in my yogurt and actually produce a cool texture to my yogurt, those are very, very high in fiber. So how we eat is also just as important as what we eat, because what studies show is people with ADHD eat faster. They often, as I mentioned before, are not even attentive to what they're eating. They tend to, I've had a number of patients that have actually had TMJ from their jaw, and a lot of it is because they chew so fast that they don't even realize how fast they're eating, that they get a lot of jaw pain from that. So what are some mindful techniques to eating? So first, and this would be a good exercise I would implore everyone to do, the next time they have a meal, is pay attention to how different foods also make you feel in the moment, how they make you feel hours later and the next day. In other words, we're so about the now that it's like, ooh, this tastes good right now, that it feels good now. And there are some foods we can all relate to that we eat in the moment and it feels good right there and then. And then maybe an hour later or 2 hours later, we're like, oh, like I don't feel so great. Or the next day we feel like bloated or we don't feel good. Or the opposite. We might eat something and we're like, yeah, this is good. And then 2 hours later, we feel like we have more energy. And the next day we feel just more energetic. We got a good night's sleep. So pay attention to I have my clients often keep like a journal, just quick bullet points. It doesn't have to be anything long and descriptive, but being even aware of the implications of what we eat and how it makes us feel. Because sometimes, I have patients who say, oh, like I just felt so sluggish and so fatigued and I don't understand. I got a good night's sleep and I'll ask them what they ate. And it turns out they might have eaten just all carbs the day before, no protein. And I'm like, well, yeah, I mean, you have no protein, you have no sustaining fuel in the tank, in the system. So that's one thing. Take a deep breath before every meal. Even like 1 minute of deep breathing has been found to center or ground somebody. Prepare one portion at a time when eating. So if you're grabbing a portion, you put on your plate, even if you know you're going to have another portion, which is fine. But eat that, go back to the table, eat that portion. And then if you want the second one, you get up and you get that second portion. I often discourage sort of like family style eating, which means that the food is on the table when you eat, as opposed to having the food be on a buffet or on the stove or whatnot, because it makes it just too easy for someone with ADHD to just grab without even thinking of it. Where at least if we're getting up to get another portion, there's a mindfulness of, okay, do I want this other portion? And there's no portion shaming here. Like sometimes you'll have 2, sometimes 3. My goal in what I want people to take away from this is, one, having some sort of more knowledge of the importance of food for the brain, and particularly for people with ADHD, understanding our risk of developing weight issues, which of course brings a whole bunch of medical consequences to it. People with ADHD are at higher risk for cardiovascular incidents, for diabetes, for a lot of things that are definitely related to that. But also, being mindful of how they eat. And it's not about, I can't have a second portion. It's if I'm going to have one, it's because I'm hungry and I've determined that I want that, in that way. Put your fork or spoon down after the food goes in your mouth and chew your food. And when it's swallowed, pick up the spoon or the fork again. I was definitely the kid that would eat like this, where, I don't even think I was done chewing whatever I just put in my mouth before I was putting like other food. And that's something that also a lot of parents, as my mom would say, even in infancy, she could see, like I used to stuff my mouth like with food, like almost like I didn't know to chew it and swallow it. So these are not, things that people should feel shame around, as much as more of a validation of understanding that their brain is just wired towards this and we just have to work with it. Try to eat as if you need to describe every aspect of the meal to someone who has never tasted that food before. So almost imagining if you had to describe blue to someone who doesn't know what blue is. So if you had to describe a slice of pizza to someone who's never had pizza, that's a good mindfulness exercise. Look for easy replacements. If you, are trying to sort of cut down on sugar intake or calories, soda is like one of the first things I worked on. I don't drink any soda. So I needed something. Straight water didn't really cut it for me. So I found, these seltzer waters, and I'm brand loyal to certain brands and certain flavors, and that does the trick. You also don't need to clean your plate, and meaning we don't want to waste food, but we also, if we are satisfied, we don't want to feel like we have to eat everything, on the plate. But again, we try to not put as much on the plate in the first place, because we also don't want to support wasting food. While you're cooking and preparing, watch what you're eating. A lot of times people snack while they're cooking. Use smaller plates and bowls when eating, so that versus in restaurants, as you notice, there's often big plates that and with big portions, and people end up eating them. If people are going to restaurants now with COVID, ask for half the meal to go right away and have the waiter or waitress just bring you half the meal in the plate. And I guarantee, and I tried this many times, and I thought, I'm going to be hungry to get that second portion. And I asked for half the portion. It came to me. I ate it. I was totally satisfied. The other portion wasn't in front of me, but I know if I had that other portion in front of me, I would have eaten it. Seat yourself accordingly, meaning don't face the food if you're sitting at the kitchen or dining room table. And just as a guide in terms of what are measurements, typically a fist is about a cup of something. Your cupped hand is about a half a cup. Your palm of your hand is about 3 ounces. So if you want to know, what does 3 ounces of meat look like? A tablespoon is your thumb, and about a teaspoon is your thumb tip. Also structure, particularly at nighttime, having things to do. You don't want to busy yourself to death in a sense, but keep a structure enough so that you're not feeling so bored that food becomes the thing you have to gravitate to. Sleep hygiene, also really, really important. When shopping at supermarkets, be honest with yourself. Know what you can't resist. I love Oreo cookies. I think they should be a scheduled substance. And I can't have a package in my house because I will eat right through them. Now, that doesn't mean I never eat Oreos. What I will do is buy the package of 6 Oreos, and that's what I will, have, because I got to have my Oreos. But that is something. Whereas there are other things I can easily just I'm not a big ice cream person, so I can have a little scoop of ice cream and I'm totally fine. Never go to the supermarket hungry. Shop outside the perimeter of the market first. That's where the fresher foods tend to be. Go when it's less crowded too, so you don't feel so stressed or rushed. Have a list of what you're going to have. And I also recommend for people to write goals like, I want to eat healthy, or I want to eat more protein this week, or I want to eat more seafood this week. Have goals in there as well. That can also be a good boost. Arrange a place in your house where all the snack foods go, so you have better track of how much you're eating. If you have snack foods in 4 different places and you're getting one from each place, you might not have a real consistent idea of how many snacks you're having. As I mentioned, get healthy staples. I put gum in there because gum is actually just a good oral for people who just need something in their mouth. Sometimes they just chew gum and they realize they're not hungry. They just need that sort of chewing stimulation. As a parent, I buy snacks for my kids that I don't like, that they like, but I'm not a big fan of. We just had Halloween. I bought Almond Joy. I do not like coconut. So those are the candies that I buy, or the candies that I'm not going to eat. Briefly, with ADHD, we've often heard of sugar is a big, is definitely the big culprit. And there is a myth that sugar causes hyperactivity. What studies have actually shown is that it's not so much that sugar causes hyperactivity, that oftentimes you'll see situations where kids are engaging in high sugar intake are also situations that you'll see kids typically hyper, like birthday parties and whatnot. Studies also show that parental expectations play a big role in that if parents know that their kids just had a lot of sugar, they tend to overestimate their hyperactivity. I'm not saying that some people may be sensitive to sugar, so I'm not discounting that. But as a whole, we wouldn't say that sugar causes hyperactivity. We do know that people with ADHD love sugar. I mean, really love sugar because we get a higher reward from it. So how do we deal with cravings? Sometimes when people do have a craving for something, I say, what is the element of what you're craving? Sometimes we're craving something salty, sweet, crunchy. Try to describe what it is, because sometimes we may want, to eat something, and then we can make choices around that. But the first question is, are you really craving something, or are you bored? And a lot of times people realize they just have nothing to do, and then they suddenly start thinking about food, and they're like, oh, I'm craving something. Well, you're not really craving it. You're trying to fill this boredom, versus sometimes we are craving something. Sometimes, like last night, I was craving something a little salty. I have these pretzel rods, and I had 2 pretzel rods that were crunchy and salty, and that's what I was, looking for. But I could have also gotten that from having potato chips, which would have been, less healthy. So we try to find, what is that? If we want something smooth, we can have a Greek yogurt, which is very smooth, or we can have a milkshake, which might not be as nutritious for us. Sometimes what we do is behaviorally is try to sort of block ourselves from when we know we're in a high trigger sort of time of day or situation. Brush your teeth, gargle with Listerine. Things you're not going to want to eat Doritos after gargling with Listerine. Sometimes once people do that, they realize, oh, I'm actually not hungry. I just wanted to eat something. Chewing gum. Now, sometimes there are some people that say chewing gum stimulates their appetite. That's not the case for me, but try it out. See what that works for you. Punt the craving. Even if you say, you know what, I'm craving this, but let me wait 15 minutes and see where I'm at in 15 minutes. And if you still crave it, enjoy it, eat it. So it's not always about not eating it, but it's about being mindful to it. Deep breathing, choosing a healthy substitute. Add the element to something else that you're eating. Like sometimes if people want something crunchy and they might gravitate to potato chips, maybe having a little granola that they put in their yogurt can satisfy that. Sometimes when we think we're hungry, we're actually thirsty. So drink and make sure you're hydrating yourself. And again, you can engage in the craving in a regulated manner and enjoy it. Have realistic expectations, common sense approaches, if we can, to try to go with more natural ingredients. Read labels. The more we know about ingredients, the better consumers we become. If you read ingredients that you're like, I have no idea what that is, chances are it's more processed. Look online for nutrition information for restaurants you eat at. Have a multivitamin so that you're making sure you're getting, the nutrition. And more is not always better. So I, work in the field of eating disorders where I work with people who may eat a lot of, let's say, kale and the broccoli and those things. More is not always better. So sometimes there are issues that you can get of having too much of something. So always consult your doctor or nutritionist. And just a note briefly, I'll go through this quickly on caffeine. Even though it's not necessarily food, but it can come in the form of coffee and sodas. The caffeine, actually, there's a lot of interesting research, and people with ADHD certainly can gravitate to caffeine. Caffeine chemically it has a similar structure to adenosine, which is a chemical in our human cells, and it depresses our central nervous system. So adenosine does. It promotes sleep, and it suppresses arousal. And what caffeine does is it binds into that receptor, and of course does the opposite effects. It allows dopamine and another neurotransmitter called glutamate to have a greater effect than what would normally occur. And so a lot of times with ADHD, we tend to say it's less about having the caffeine high, because many people with ADHD don't report a caffeine high. But what caffeine does allow is for more of a pronounced dopamine effect from whatever else, that they might be doing. For people with ADHD who are on stimulants, they may desire caffeine less. But caffeine isn't this bad villain. In fact, the Mayo Clinic recommends that you can have 3 to 4 cups a day. I mean, they're not saying have 3 or 4 cups a day, but if you have more than that, that's where it starts to be and could sort of work against you. But there are some health effects from caffeine. Well, first of all, so to keep in mind that decaf coffee also does contain caffeine. It doesn't contain as much. It can take about 4 to 6 hours for caffeine to leave the system. So be wary of when you're doing it. Although some people with ADHD say they might have a cup before they go to bed, and it might help them sleep. I've seen that definitely happen. So you want to talk to your doctor. And the benefits of caffeine are in the form of coffee, not sodas. Sodas have tremendous amounts of sugar in them. Probably one of the least one of the worst things you could probably put in your body. Now, again, if you like a Coke, have a Coke, but be aware of if you have a lot of it, that's really not good for you. But caffeine has short-term benefits of improving working memory, can decrease fatigue, speed reaction time. And it's been actually shown to, again, in moderate amounts, I'm not talking heavy caffeine use, in potentially helping with the prevention of type 2 diabetes and liver disease. And the antioxidants in caffeine and in coffee may help with reducing risk of dementia and Parkinson's disease. So there's a lot of interesting research looking at caffeine. Now, of course, there's risks. I'm not talking about children and teens and elderly people who are more vulnerable to dependence and health effects. So those benefits are looking at adult studies between 18 and 50s. For children 10 to 12, the Mayo Clinic recommends no more than 85 milligrams of caffeine maximum. And again, it can boost blood pressure in a way that can increase heart disease. Certainly energy drinks, I do not ever recommend. Some of those have up to 400 milligrams of caffeine, and it's typically drunk faster because it's not hot coffee. And I've seen really not so good things happen when people consume that much caffeine. And being aware of your sugar intake. A lot of people, when they have a cup or two of coffee, might be putting a cup or two of sugar in it as well. And just being aware of, again, being mindful of what you're doing there. Caffeine can affect sleep. It could decrease bone density and certainly lead to irritability and anxiety, stomach aches if you're having too much of it. So again, it's one of those things that a little bit is fine, might even actually be healthy, but you go past the line and it starts to be unhealthy. And I will leave it there for questions and answers.
Oh, that was great. Thank you. Thank you very much. I especially related to the Chuck E. Cheese story, and that piece is sitting there. I think a lot of us actually did, because it's in the questions here. But one thing, what about food dyes and the ADHD brain? Several people said, could you just talk briefly about that as you choose food items to eat for your child or yourself?
Yeah, so there's more and more research looking at food dyes. Now, in general, I would say, again, the more natural we go in our ingredients, the better. So if you had a choice between eating something that had red dye 40, lake blue 50, whatever these are, or not, I would say to try to go for the not in them. And there are some people, absolutely, I mean, we know that kids with ADHD might have, and adults might have hypersensitivities or more likely to have certain sensitivities, either food sensitivities or allergies. And some of them might have responses to some of those food dyes. However, the majority of people with ADHD, it's not that the food dyes necessarily cause ADHD. The research is not compelling that it exacerbates the ADHD. It's again, keeping in mind that those food dyes are typically going to be in products that also are high in sugar. And if you're having a lot of sugar, it means that you're most likely not having a lot of nutrients. And that's what's exacerbating the ADHD symptoms. So again, I would not promote food dyes by any means. If you can try to limit them, why not? And at the same time, it's not, oh my gosh, you had these food dyes. Now, it's, in other words, it's not a treatment for ADHD if we were to have an elimination diet of food dyes, except for people who might actually have allergies to them or have food sensitivities to them.
Mm-hmm. One person is asking, so trying to distill what you said, for breakfast, would you recommend a higher protein content meal to set the stage for the day?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That, in fact, I mean, when I was a kid, my mom used to say like cereal is like eating air, which is true. I mean, like I'm never satisfied like eating cereal. Like I found it's like I'm hungry like 15 minutes later. So, my mom used to sometimes feed me chicken and rice that was left over from dinner the night before. And that was my breakfast. And it totally made the difference. So, as we know, having ADHD, we kind of live our lives outside the box in many ways. And No one says breakfast has to just be cereal, oatmeal, yogurt, eggs. We can have chicken. We can have red meat from the night before. But absolutely, if you can start your day with high protein, if I love eggs, like I could eat eggs every day. You can eat eggs, yogurt, fruit, within the yogurt, that does actually set your tone. And again, I always implore people, keep a sort of a log of, those days that maybe you just have the bowl of cereal that might not be fortified with a lot of nutrients. How do you feel by 10 o'clock that morning, 11 o'clock that morning versus when you have, a big bowl of Greek yogurt with blueberries in it, a slice of whole grain toast with peanut butter on it. You'll find that's a lot more satisfying and more sustaining throughout the day.
Mm-hmm. How are you what recommendations do you have for increasing omega-3 fatty acid levels in children? There are a lot of those gummies out there now, but I've also heard from nutritionists that they don't contain high enough levels of EPA and DHA to really have a positive effect. So, and we know that children don't eat a lot of fish, most children. So, any strategies around that?
Yeah, nuts can carry a lot of omega-3 as well. Various nuts, olive oil. So a lot of times what parents I work with might do is they just cook their food with, put a lot extra olive oil in it, and their kids, will eat it and they sort of get it that way. Even with fish though, too, is that there are ways, even if you, put some breadcrumbs on it or if there's a seasoning that your kid likes, like I have, a teenager I'm working with and he loves hot sauces, like really like buffalo wing sauce. So, his parents will make like haddock and different fish, like buffalo haddock instead of like buffalo chicken. And he loves it. He just wants the sauce. And so it's almost like the fish is just a vehicle to eat the sauce. So a lot of times, even with food, we can be creative and think, well, let's not assume, oh, my kid doesn't like fish. It's like, well, if you present it a certain way or combine it with some ingredient that maybe they will like, maybe they could have it more. But nuts is a great omega-3 and olive oil often.
Mm-hmm. What about ADHD medication and diet? We all know that at least for a couple of weeks, once you get the dose right, that appetite tends to go down a little. But once the dose is correct, it picks back up. Are there any enlightenment you'd like to provide for parents whose child is on medication or an adult?
Yes. So particularly with children and teenagers, because they're still growing and we want to make sure that they're getting their proper nutrition. If anything, even more so, those kids, typically what I recommend is a big breakfast. At lunchtime, they're typically not hungry. If they do have not every person has appetite suppression from stimulants, but the ones that do will often report at lunchtime they're just not hungry, and then they're hungry later in the day. So you sort of load up the calories, but even more so, especially for kids, especially now where, a lot of kids are doing classes on Zoom remotely, they need all the executive fuel they can get. So that morning, breakfast, put in the protein, and then as a snack, having like a protein bar, and finding ones that they like. I mean, there are there are some that taste like sawdust and there are some that taste really good. And they can pack like sometimes 20 grams of protein in one of those protein bars. So finding ways of getting, their nutrients, but not being so worried. Like if they're eating enough breakfast, they're having enough dinner, they don't have lunch, they'll be okay in that way. But it's really just important in making sure, especially now after, let's say for dinner, those kids who might not eat at lunchtime, then when the medication starts wearing off, they might be starving, like really hungry. And that can predispose a lot of kids to then want candy and those quick sugar sources. And to know that they're not doing that because, they're not eating the chocolate chip cookies because they are bad or anything like that. It's that they're hungry and they need a quick source. So having foods and snacks that they can eat once that medication wears off, that's just available to them. And, also keeping in mind, it's like the seafood diet. If we have, our cookies and our chips and everything in display, that's what we're going to more likely eat versus if we have the bowl of fruit and the protein bar and, some other things in display, like even like hard boiled eggs. Like, I have a patient who, he knows that when he comes home from work, he has to, prepare dinner. And in that time, he's already hungry. Then in the past, he would just snack on a bunch of things while he was preparing dinner. And then he would be kind of full from eating all those snacks. So he boils a dozen hard-boiled eggs on a Sunday, leave them in his fridge. And when he wants like a snack, instead of going for the pint of ice cream or whatnot, he'll get an egg, he'll put a little salt on it, and he's good to go.
Mm-hmm. Where do supplements fit in terms of a healthy diet for the ADHD brain?
So that varies. It's, I think in a lot of ways, I always, encourage people to talk to their doctors about it because again, with supplements, it's more is not always better. And so sometimes people are getting enough of a vitamin or a nutrient that they need that they don't need, a supplement for. So supplements are good if, let's say, you are eating a diet that doesn't have a specific nutrient, particularly like if you're a vegetarian or if you're a vegan, there are going to be certain nutrients you're going to need to supplement to keep you healthy. So I always recommend that people talk to their doctors about that or nutritionists about that in terms of, as opposed to making these general recommendations because everybody really is different. But I would say, don't assume that just because it's a healthy supplement that it's going to be good for you. It really depends on what you're eating, what nutrients, you have. Cause sometimes with supplements, people can have adverse effects if it's, if it's too much of something, or just the way that supplement might be metabolizing in their body, that our body really is more meant to take in our nutrients through food rather than a pill. And at the same time, there are going to be certain nutrients, like someone might have a certain vitamin deficiency that they need to eat a pound of something to get, and that's not going to be useful. So they're going to need that vitamin or that supplement in that way.
Right. Several people aren't familiar with GABA, but they were sort of fascinated by it, and they're wondering if there are ways through food or supplements to increase those GABA levels in the brain.
That I don't know. That's a good question. I'll definitely look into that. I'm not aware of any right off the bat, but I'll look into that. That's a great question.
And what about picky eaters, kids who are picky eaters? And loads of parents have mentioned that here, and even some adults. They eat 4, 5, 6 foods. And how do you get through to a child? I mean, is it time for nutrition counseling? Is there ever a moment where a parent can't convince their child to eat the right thing?
Yeah. So picky eating is really important to pay attention to because especially for children, studies have shown that kids who are very picky eaters, that when they follow them tend to fall in a couple categories. So one, we see it in ADHD. So the picky eater really is a kid that says, these are the 4 things that I know I like and my brain is getting a reward for, and I don't want to eat anything else, which sets that kid up in a way where they're more likely to gravitate only to things that deliver instant reward and gratification. And those are the same kind of qualities that can sort of open the neural pathways for addiction in that way. I'm not saying that every kid that's a picky eater is going to be addicted to something, but at the same time, if that's the motivation. The other thing, though, is that there's some kids who are picky eaters that when they follow them find that they become adults who are very risk adverse. And so sometimes a picky eater is, I don't know if I will like that. And I don't want the negative experience of not liking it. So they're almost like willing to just not even try it. But so what I always tell parents is why it's so important to work through this is that this is more than just about the food. We don't want a child to just say, I think this will make me feel bad, so I'm not going to try it. Versus, in things that we don't want them to be risk adverse about, opportunities and things like that, as opposed to, well, no, we know that now it's different, of course, when we're talking about drugs, because we know drugs are not good for you. So there is a reason to be risk adverse to that. But here's broccoli, and maybe you might not like it, but let's see how, you might surprise yourself. And again, if it's broccoli, let's melt some cheese on it. Let's put some, let's put some seasoning. Let's put buffalo sauce on it. Trying different things, whatever. But sometimes it's how it's presented in different ways that allow them to eat that. And with adults I work with, it really is like food exposure. I guess first is how much of it is a problem for them. If they're able to get their nutrients, sometimes they don't see it as a problem. But I do work with adults who, even though they're getting their nutrition, say it's problematic in terms of when they're on dates and stuff like that. It feels awkward if they only eat like 4 or 5 different things. So we start kind of working at exposures and being aware that some people with ADHD do have tactile and sort of texture sensitivities and things like that we also want to validate as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the hour is up. That was great, Roberto, as usual. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us.
Very welcome.
And thanks to all of the attendees for joining us, and have a great day.
For more Attitude Podcast and information on living well with attention deficit, visit attitudemag.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com.